it is not the composed, which must be sought first to bring forth the representation of a whole, as if through viewing, but it is the composing, forma dat essere, and the concept of this action which must be presumed. A whole can as such not be viewed but must be sought, and by that the material of the representation must be subordinated under the form of the cognition of the object in order to make a concept of the composed. Immanuel Kant. As I already stated at the beginning of the last lecture, but as cannot be stated and emphasized enough, the table of categories is really at the core of Kant's whole philosophical system and of the whole architectonic of Kant. What Kant is saying is that there are 12, as he calls them, categories. That is, 12 concepts of pure reason that we don't get out of experience, but rather that, so to say, shape our experience, that are conditions of the possibility of even making experience. Without them, we can't make experience, or rather, we can't think at all. All our thinking has to happen within those 12 categories. That also means that everything you do think, and every system of thinking, every science you try to establish, or every time you examine a certain concept, a certain idea, can be categorized by these 12 categories. And that is exactly why you will always find them in Kant's writings. But the thing is, he will not always explicitly name them. So in many of his texts, you will find a certain idea, like the idea of the state or of an organic being, be explained according to various aspects. And if you have the table of categories in mind, you will realize that these aspects are not random. Kant is not randomly saying, oh, this idea has these 3 qualities, but rather you will find that these qualities map perfectly to the table of categories. And so I can't stress enough how important it is to really understand the table of categories in order to really understand Kant. At the same time, as I also stated before, unfortunately, it's rarely explained in detail. It's hard to find someone diving deeper into the table of categories. Usually they are brushed over or they are taken all together as the one table of categories, but you won't often find someone explaining them all in detail to you. So that's exactly why I want to do this. Usually these lectures are intended to sort of stand on themselves, because, of course, I'm aware not everyone wants to listen to many hours or even days or weeks of me speaking about Kant, but rather maybe you're just interested in a certain topic, and that's perfectly fine. But in this case, I will point out that the table of categories is based on the table of judgments. Kant is saying, after all, that our thinking works in 12 ways. All our thinking is connecting, and there are 12 sorts of connections we can make. We judge, we connect in these 12 manners, and therefore, from these 12 functions of judgment, 12 concepts, 12 categories can be derived. So that's why I recommend, in this case, watching the previous lecture on the table of judgments first, because that will help understanding the categories better. Many misunderstandings of the categories only arise if you are not mindful of the judgments on which they are based. But with that out of the way, let's delve into the table of categories. And like the table of judgments, it is made up of 12 categories that are grouped in 4 groups of 3. And 2 of those groups, the categories of quantity and quality, are belonging to the mathematical class, while 2 other groups, the categories of relation and modality, belong to the dynamic class. The mathematical class, Kant says, is about, so all 12 categories are about a connection of the manifold, as that is basically all our intellect does, connecting a manifold, creating a synthetic unity of that manifold. But the first 2 groups, the mathematical groups, they are about the composition of that which is of the same kind. While the dynamic class is about the composition of the manifold which is of different kind. So when Kant uses the names mathematical and dynamic class here, that's not referring to mathematics as such, as a science, or to dynamics as a part of physics. Rather, he just uses these names because of a sort of an analogy, because in mathematics you always deal with the composition of that which is of the same kind, right? If the question is what is 4x plus 5y, we can't solve that because x and y, they are different. They can't just be added to one another. But if you ask what is 4x plus 5x, then that works. That is 9x because x can be added to x. So in that way, mathematics is really always about connecting things of the same kind, while the dynamic class is named so because it connects things of a different kind. So in the mathematical class, you will have the categories of quantity, and quantity means having things of the same kind. For example, the sheep of a herd or the trees of a forest. You can say they form a quantity, they belong together precisely because they are all in a way the same. They are all sheep or they are all trees. Or in quality, it is, Kant says, about the degrees of a thing. So you can say the degrees of temperature. If you have something that is 20 degrees, then there's 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, and so on till 20 degrees being added together, so to say, in that thing. Or if you have weight, if you say someone is, I don't know, 80 kilos, then kilos are of the same kind, and you are saying that there are 80 of those combined in that person. So in that way, quantity and quality are mathematic categories to Kant because they add things of the same kind, while, for example, causality, as one of the categories of relation, belongs to the dynamic class because, let's say, the sun is melting a block of ice, then they are not of the same kind, right? The sun is different from the ice or from the process of melting that it causes. So here the relation is dynamic, Kant says. There is a sort of power, a sort of force from the sun to the ice that is melting it and that is connecting them both. So let's start with this mathematic class where you have a sort of composition of things of the same kind. And the first group of categories here is the categories of quantity. They are the category of unity, of multiplicity, and of the all, of everything. That is universality, you could say. And I don't think I have to say much about those categories. That's probably the easiest group of categories to explain. You will probably know what it means for something to be one or many or everything. So what I will say is that in general, Kant says this group of categories is about thinking one thing in many things. So when I say there is a herd of sheep, so there's a multiplicity of sheep, there are many sheep here, or there's a multiplicity of trees in the forest, then I'm thinking one concept, the concept of sheep or of tree. And let me remind you what I said in previous lectures. A concept is a general representation, Kant says. So in a concept, I'm thinking general attributes. In a concept, I'm thinking a rule, because that's what the intellect is. It is the faculty of rules. And I'm saying that this one rule, so for example, the rule for sheep includes being a mammal and therefore having live children that drink milk at first. The rule for sheep may include growing wool and so on. I am thinking this one rule in many individuals, applying to many individuals. That is what all the categories of quantity are about. Thinking one in many. And I will also stress that these categories of quantity, they need one another. You can't really think one of them without the other, right? If you want to think something as being one and not many, you still need the concept of many, of multiplicity, because what is one if not the composition of many? So when I say this is one forest, then there need to be many trees in it. And I am now applying the concept of unity by saying, okay, this multiplicity sort of doesn't matter to me, despite them being many. As a forest, they are still one. Same when I say here's one herd of sheep. But the same is true for the individuals. So if I say this is one tree or one sheep, they are also a multiplicity. The tree has many leaves, many branches, but still I'm saying they all belong together to one. If I talk about myself, no matter if it's physically, my body has many parts, the head, the arms, the legs, and so on, or going even further, it is a multiplicity of cells. Or even below that, it's a multiplicity of atoms. Or also not physically, but psychologically, I can say there are many thoughts, many desires, many memories and feelings and so on. But they are all one. And I can't really think the one without the many. That's a very old insight in philosophy, an insight that philosophers had even in antiquity. Neoplatonism was based on that insight, understanding that the one as such can't be understood, can't be cognized, there needs to be a multiplicity. The one couldn't think of itself because thinking already requires two. It requires subject and object, or rather it requires three because it also requires their connection somehow, the subject being connected to the object. This, by the way, is something that Christian theologians took up to sort of prove the Trinity with that, saying, yes, exactly, so you can't just have one singular God. He couldn't be understood and he couldn't even understand himself. This God as a father needs to sort of view himself in the Son, and their connection would be the Spirit. Now, Kant wouldn't go with that because, after all, the whole point of the critique of pure reason is to show that our thinking, our rules of thinking, only apply to ourselves and our consciousness, and therefore to the representations in our consciousness. Therefore, that is the insight of transcendental idealism. Therefore, to all the objects in the world, the objects in nature, the objects of experience, because they are only in my consciousness. They are, after all, not things in themselves, but they are representations. They are the things as they appear to me. So therefore, the rules of my thinking must apply to them, or else they would not appear to me. But we can't just apply those same rules to a thing in itself. We can't apply those same rules to God. So all we can say is, okay, we cannot think of God in another way, but that doesn't say that God's own inner nature necessarily must be that way. But I will get to what Kant says about God and also what he says about the Trinity, which does have a place in his moral theology. I will get to that at a much later point. For now, let's stay for a moment longer with the categories of quantity. So the one, at least the one that we can think or that we can perceive, must be a multiplicity, a unity of many parts. I mean, the absolutely singular cannot just be not thought of, not conceived of. You also couldn't view it, like in actual empirical viewing. You can't ever see a mathematical point, right? If you try to draw a point, you have already drawn a small circle. An actual point, which really is just a unity, which really has no parts, no extension at all, is something you could not possibly see. But in the same way, the concept of multiplicity, of course, requires the concept of unity. Because what is a multiplicity, if not a multiplicity of one? You can only think of the forest or of the herd of sheep if you have many singular trees or many singular sheep. And of course, if we are talking about universality, it's quite clear that that is on one hand a multiplicity, because it includes many things, even all things. But on the other hand, it is a unity because it is all these many things together. I have only one more thing to add, and that is that as I said at the start and as I said in the last two lectures, the categories of our thinking Kant derives from the judgments, the functions of our judgments. And if you look back at the table of judgments, the judgments of quantity were the universal judgment, the particular judgment, and the singular judgment. And as for the middle one, I think it's quite clear how the particular judgment, the judgment that is not judging about all things or about just one thing, but rather about many things, about multiplicity, but a limited multiplicity of things, like saying some people are philosophers, or some people live here in Germany, or many people can swim, or whatever. It's quite clear, I think, that this judgment corresponds to the concept of multiplicity. But as for the other two concepts, the way the table of judgments and the table of categories are structured in the Critique of Pure Reason would imply that the universal judgments lead to the concept of unity, and the singular judgments lead to the concept of universality. And that seems to not be right. And I must admit, I never could make sense of that when reading Kant. To me, it would make much more sense to turn the judgments of quantity on their head, to change their order, and to say that the singular judgments must come first, and therefore they are the ones corresponding to unity, and the universal judgments must come last, and from them is derived the concept of universality. And indeed, we do find in Kant's lecture on the Philosophical Encyclopedia, we do find this different order of the table of judgments. This order that I think makes more sense. So why would it be ordered wrongly in the Critique of Pure Reason? I don't think it's a simple mistake, because then Kant should have spotted it and corrected it in the second edition of that work. And also then he shouldn't have repeated it in his Prolegomena, which is another work. I rather would assume that it is a concession to the logicians of his day, because many of the judgments that he talks about were already known to the logicians. And so in their ordering, in their structuring, he probably made a concession to the logicians, especially since, as I discussed in the last lecture, they had the universal judgment, but they sort of excluded the singular judgment and said that it could be expressed in a universal judgment. That might be why Kant talked about the universal judgment first and then the singular judgment later. And he probably just silently assumes that his readers will be, well, observant enough when reading the Critique of Pure Reason to understand that the table of judgments must be turned on its head in this case. Otherwise, I wouldn't know how to explain this. But anyways, let's continue on to the categories of quality. While the categories of quantity are about thinking one in many, so for example thinking the one concept of tree in all the trees of the forest, saying these many trees, they all share the same, so to say, quality of treeness. The concepts of quality are the opposite. They are about thinking many in one, Kant says. So here you have, for example, things like the temperature of an object, or the brightness of an object, the heaviness of an object, the knowledge of a person. And so you think many things in one. So many degrees of temperature, or many kilos, or many cognitions, many pieces of knowledge combined in one object. And the quantity means, when you want to extend the quantity, you need to extend the object in time and space, right? If I want to extend the quantity of the forest or of the herd of sheep, then I need to add more trees or more sheep, meaning they will grow bigger in space. Same if I want to add add to the quantity of something in time. Like if I want to add to the quantity of this video, for example, I need to make it longer, so it runs an hour longer. But the quality doesn't change when the quantity is expanded, right? I can add 1,000 or 1,000,000 more sheep to the herd of sheep, but it still will be a herd of sheep. It will be a bigger herd, but the sheepness, or also the herdness, will still remain. Now, when it comes to quality, it's the other way around. Kant says here, if I want to expand the quality, or to intensify it, the object as such doesn't have to grow. It's just that this quality has to change and to grow, right? So if I want to heat up water, I can have the same amount of water, just I can think of it as having more degrees of temperature. Or I can think of the same person learning more things, having more knowledge, while still not extending in quantity. So Kant would say, for example, I can think of water as just being a single drop of water, or I can think of water as being a whole bathtub, or even a whole ocean. And that is just a difference of quantity. But now I can think of the same water as either being ice cold, or being hot and cooking. And that is a difference in quantity. And one is not necessarily connected to the other. I can think of the drop of water as being ice cold, or as being very hot, or I can think of it as having a different quality, or I can think of the water in the ocean as being cold or hot. But now let's turn to the specific categories of quality. They are reality, negation, and limitation. And here it is the first one which needs the most explanation, or rather the most clarification, because of the way the word reality is nowadays used in everyday language. It is used as being synonymous with existence. And that is not how Kant means it here. Existence is its own category, belonging to the last group, to the categories of modality. I will get there later on in this lecture. But reality, it comes from Latin, res, meaning thing. So the reality is the thingness of something. And what Kant means by that is a certain quality actually being there in an object. So when I say my t-shirt is wet, I'm saying the red color has reality in that t-shirt. But if this wasn't an actually existing t-shirt, if I were to just hallucinate or dream that t-shirt, the red color would still have reality in that t-shirt. Just like that, I can say the magic power has reality in Harry Potter because he is a wizard. So he has this attribute of having magic power. And like every reality, it could be intensified or it could be lessened, right? I could think of the red in this t-shirt as becoming more intense or becoming more pale. And just like that, I could think of someone's magical abilities growing stronger, him becoming more powerful, or him becoming weaker. This is not making any statement about whether Harry Potter or magic in general exists. It's just saying that when I think of Harry Potter in this concept, so the rules I'm thinking, the magic power has reality. You can compare this category with the second one of quality, that is with negation. Like in the t-shirt, I can say the red color has reality, and at the same time, I can negate the blue color or the green color or whatever, because the t-shirt is not blue or green. So reality here really just means the opposite of negation. It means that something is there as opposed to not being there. But it is not making a statement about the thing as a whole existing. And this is where it becomes especially helpful to turn to the table of judgments, because if you remember, the three judgments of quality were the affirming judgment, the negating judgment, and the infinite judgment. So the reality as a category belongs to the affirming judgments. And that maybe makes it more clear, that maybe helps you not confusing reality, as Kant uses the word, with existence, but understanding that this really is about thingness. This really is about saying this is a thing in this object. So the affirmative judgments, they were just about saying that a predicate belongs to a subject. So saying that the t-shirt is red is an affirmative judgment. It is saying that the subject t-shirt has this predicate red. And just like that, saying Harry Potter is a wizard is an affirmative judgment. It says that the subject Harry Potter has this quality, this attribute, this predicate of being a wizard, of having magical powers. And that is why the category of reality is about that. Saying the red color or the magical power has reality in that thing, in the t-shirt or in Harry Potter. Maybe it would have been better if Kant, and maybe it would have prevented misunderstandings in our day, if Kant had called this category the category of position. Because, I mean, in the Latin, position is really the opposite of negation, right? The word position comes from ponere, which means to put. So to put something there, to put it in a place. And I mean, that's also where we take the word position from. The position you have in the world is, so to say, the place you have been put, the place where you are positioned. And you can also think of, if you test yourself for a certain illness, like if you make a COVID test and it's positive, or if you say you are HIV positive. Nowadays, people use positive to mean good and negative to mean bad. But obviously in this case, positive doesn't mean good. Positive just means the position of that sickness in you. It means that, yes, you indeed have this sickness. While if the test is negative, it means that the sickness is not there. You don't have that illness. So maybe we could speak of the category of position, the category of something being there. And by the way, I'm also saying this to once again point out what I talked about in my lecture on concepts. That is the fact that a concept is not a word. The word is just a name you give it, but the concept is that which you actually think. The name is just supposed to make you think of that concept. And so that is exactly why we can differ in the words we use, while still referring to the same concept, and why we can maybe disagree with someone's usage of certain words and say that another word might express that concept better or might serve better to make people think of the concept you want them to think about, instead of leading them to think about something else. But in the end, it is about the concept. It doesn't matter if we call this category reality or position, or if we call it Paul, as long as we know what we are talking about. So anyways, we have reality, and we have negation, and then lastly we have limitation. So a sort of half reality, right? Reality being limited by negation. Kant gives examples like saying reality would be light, negation would be darkness, because darkness is not its own thing, right? It's not really something that exists. It's just the absence of light. There is no darkness as such, and we can't say that something is spreading darkness in the same way as a lamp or the sun is spreading light. We can only say where there is no light, there is darkness. Darkness is the absence of light, so it is a negation of the reality of light. The same could be said of other things, like the cold is just an absence of heat. It's not its own thing, as any physicist will tell you. Or if you say someone has ignorance as opposed to having knowledge, then that ignorance is not its own thing. It's not that he has other things in his head than the person who has pieces of knowledge in his head, but rather he has nothing in that place because he's ignorant. It's just the absence of knowledge. And again, limitation would be some reality and some negation. So Kant gives, for example, the example of light, darkness, and shadow. Shadow would be the limitation. Or there is knowledge, which as full reality would be all-knowing, like God. There is ignorance, like as full negation, it would be being completely ignorant, knowing nothing. And then there is half knowledge, or knowing something but not everything. That would be limited knowledge. And here it should become clear that actually the things we experience in the world are usually limited things. We usually don't experience full reality or full negation of a quality, but rather we experience that quality in some degree that at least in thinking, could still be intensified. If you meet a person, even someone who knows a lot, even the most knowledgeable, best educated person in the world, will still be ignorant in some ways, will still not know everything. So really his knowledge is limited. And also, when you think of heat, even something extremely hot like the sun will probably not be as hot as is possible. You can always at least think, even if something hotter doesn't actually exist in the world, so you can't find something hotter, at least you can think of something hotter. There's no reason to think that this specific hotness is as hot as it possibly gets. So really you can say that the heat of the sun is limited. Certainly much less limited than the heat of an oven, or even less limited than the heat of a block of ice, but still it is limited heat. It is not the full reality of heat. And we need, however, we need the concept of reality to even conceive of the concept of limitation and to experience something limited. Like if you meet a person who is very, very knowledgeable, but of course not all-knowing, you do need, even if this doesn't happen consciously and only unconsciously, Kant would say, you still need to have the concept of complete knowledge in order to be able to judge that this person doesn't have complete knowledge. You must be able to think of someone knowing more than this person, and then you must compare this actual person you are meeting with your concept of full knowledge in order to realize that he doesn't have this full knowledge. If you didn't have this concept of the full reality of knowledge, you couldn't say that, oh, it could be possible to know more than you know, so therefore you don't know everything. Same with the heat. If you didn't have the concept of complete heat, of something being as hot as possible, so hot that nothing hotter could exist, and of course there is no such thing, but if you couldn't think such a thing, then you also couldn't make the judgment that an actual thing's heat is limited and could still be intensified. This, by the way, becomes very important for the attempted proof of God, because God has been defined as the most real entity, and well, here the argument would be you need the idea of something most real, of something having all the realities, something being all-knowing and almighty and so on, because without that idea and without comparing things to that idea and seeing how close or how far away they are from that full reality, you couldn't judge them to not be the fullest reality. And of course, everyone, including the atheist, judges things to not be of the fullest reality. So that would mean that even the atheist needs this idea, at least unconsciously, of the most real thing. That is an argument for God that Kant discusses. I will get to that at a later point. And to be clear here, he's ultimately putting that argument aside. He's saying this doesn't work. But still, it is the best argument you can come up with as far as theoretical, as speculative arguments go. Anyways, So those are the categories of quantity. When it comes to reality, once you understood how the word reality is meant here, and don't confuse it with existence, then it becomes clear how reality is connected to the affirmative judgments. And likewise, it is, I think, clear how negation is connected to the negative judgments. Someone might, however, ask how exactly is limitation as a concept related to the infinite judgments. Remember, infinite judgments were those kinds of judgments that are affirmative, meaning the copula, the connecting word is not negated but affirmed. You are saying that something, your subject, that you are making a judgment about, that it is something, but then that something, the predicate which you are affirming of that subject, that something is negated. So when you are saying the soul is not mortal, that is a negative judgment, because you are negating the is. You are saying this predicate of mortality does not belong to the soul, it is not mortal. But when you are saying the soul is immortal, you are affirming something. You are saying this predicate does belong to the soul. The soul is immortal, but the predicate itself is a negation. It is immortality. Or I said, when you judge that humans are not birds, that's just negative judgment. But when you are saying humans are non-birds, you are actually saying humans are something. But that something, being a non-bird, is only defined by what it is not. Well, what does that have to do with limitation? I addressed this in the last lecture. I said that according to Kant, you could think of a concept as a sphere, like you could draw a circle representing that concept. And if you just say humans are not birds, then you have that sphere representing the birds, and you're just saying humans do not belong within that sphere. But you are not saying where they do belong. And you are not saying where that sphere, or if that sphere of birds ends at all. But if you are saying that human beings are non-birds, then you're putting them into another sphere, and this is what's important now, that other sphere of non-birds limits the sphere of the birds, Kant says. Because by this infinite judgment, you are saying that not everything is a bird. There is another class of things, which might have several subclasses, like mammals and reptiles and fish and things that are not living beings at all, like metals or I don't know. But anyways, you are at least saying that there is another class of beings besides the birds, that is the beings of the non-birds. And the non-birds limit the birds. They are saying birds are not everything that is. So that is why the limitation is the category belonging to the infinite judgments. And here you can also say, I said in the last lecture that in both mathematical groups, in quantity and in quality, Kant acknowledges that the first and the last judgment, universal and singular judgments, affirmative and infinite judgments, that formally they are quite the same when you just look at them with the purely formal eye of the logician. And so in logic, distinguishing between them is not really necessary. It would be an unnecessary subtlety. But now, when it comes to the table of categories, and when it comes to ontology, instead of logic, Kant is not interested in just the formal structure of our thinking, but rather he's interested in the content of our thinking. The table of categories, after all, is meant to include all the concepts that are, so to say, the base, the elemental concepts we have, that are not empirical concepts that we acquire through experience, but rather concepts coming out of our own intellect. And as concepts, they don't just have a form. I mean, the form of every concept, empirical or purely intellectual, is just its generality. But rather, as concepts, they also have matter. They have a content. They have something that they mean. And this is what Kant is interested here. And that is why it was important in the table of judgments to distinguish these forms of judgments, even if for the logician that's not really necessary, because here you can see that they lead to, even if as judgments they can be grouped together, as categories they lead to very different concepts. I will also, as a last thing, add that the concept of limitation and the corresponding infinite judgment is quite important to Kant's transcendental philosophy and to understanding that transcendental philosophy. And I already made its own lecture about what is transcendental idealism. Because that transcendental philosophy is basically based on an infinite judgment, on the concept of limitation, because it is based on the insight that we only experience sensual objects, sensibilia, or phenomena, as Kant calls them, the things that appear to us. And it is based on the insight that those are not the things in themselves, the things that we cannot experience through our senses, the things that we cannot view, the things that we can only think of. Intelligiblia or noumena, as Kant calls them. So basically, this is an infinite judgment. When you talk about the thing in itself, how is it defined? It is defined as a non-sensual object. I mean, Kant even talks about sensuality and supersensuality. I also made a lecture about that. And the very name, supersensuality, it expresses no quality of its own. Like, the name doesn't tell you what the supersensual is. It only really tells you what it is not. That it is not sensuality. That it is somehow different from sensuality. Likewise in the name metaphysics, right? I mean, it comes from physics, which is the doctrine of nature, coming from the Greek word for nature. And metaphysics is just that which is beyond or above nature. But that doesn't really tell you what it is, just what it is not, that it is not nature. And Kant's whole point is that we cannot make an affirmative statement of the thing in itself. Like, we cannot say what it is. We can only make affirmative statements of the things that appear to us. We can only make this infinite statement that it is a non-sensual object. It is not a phenomenon. It is something else, something non-phenomenal. And therefore, the concept of a thing in itself, and Kant explicitly says that several times, is meant to be a limitation, a limiting concept that limits our thinking about objects by telling us these objects that you deal with, the objects that you perceive and experience, they are only that. They are only the objects you experience, the objects that appear to you, they are not the things in themselves, the things independently from you. It is very important to understand this, to understand that the thing in itself in Kant's philosophy is a concept of limitation, because there have been many, many misunderstandings of Kant to this day that are based on taking the thing in itself to be its own positive thing. Like anyone who thinks that Kant's philosophy is just a new type of skepticism, or at least it leads to a new type of skepticism. And that was an interpretation even in Kant's own day that he forked. But it's an interpretation that continues to this very day. People read Kant and they hear, okay, the things appearing to me are not the thing in itself. And they think, oh, so therefore, the things that appear to me, they are not real, they are just illusions. And the real thing is out there somewhere, but I can't reach it. And so they think this is all skepticism. But rather, you have to understand that the thing in itself is not meant to be its own thing that is out there somewhere. It is the same thing as the thing that appears to you. They are not two different things. They are one and the same. And Kant is not even saying that the thing in itself exists so much. I mean, he's a bit unclear about that. But Fichte was more clear and more consistent. And if you're a real proper transcendental idealist, you will basically say there is no thing in itself. There is only the thing that appears to you. Outside of consciousness being conscious of objects, there cannot be any objects. All the thing in itself as a concept is meant to do is point you towards this transcendental idealism. It is there to remind you that these things around you in the world that you deal with, that you think about, that you experience, whose laws you might examine as a natural scientist, they are appearances. They are in your consciousness. They are your own representations, and therefore must also be under the laws according to which your consciousness works. They must follow the laws of your representations, because otherwise you couldn't have them as representations. And that is what the concept of a thing in itself should remind you of. These are appearances. These are your representations. They are not things in themselves. But that is not making any positive affirmative statements about such thing in itself, not even the statement that they exist. But with that, let's close off this part and let's turn on to the dynamic class, which, as I said before, is about a connection of the manifold, not of the same kind, but of manifold elements of a different kind. And the first group of these categories is the categories of relation. And they, Kant says, are about things being dependent on one another and being subordinated to one another in their existence. So the categories of relation are substance and accidents, cause and effect, and community, and or the whole and the parts. And if you think about those, they are all about subordination of things, about a thing depending on another thing in its existence. So if, according to the first of the categories, substance and accidents, you say the rose is red, so the rose as a substance has this accidents, this attribute of being red, then you're saying the red depends on the rose. It can't exist without the rose. Or according to the second category, if you say that the ice melting is the effect of the sun and the sun is the cause of it, then you are saying the melting and the subsequent water that the ice will turn into depends in its existence on the sun as its cause. And lastly, if you take the example of the heart and the body, the heart as a part of the body depends on it in its existence. It can only exist as part of the body. It developed as part of that body, and it cannot be without that body. But let's once again talk about each of these concepts. First off, as I said, you have what in philosophical terminology is called substance and accidents, or as Kant also calls the category of subsistence and inherence. What it means is the substance Kant defines as that which can exist independently, not as a quality of another thing, but as its own thing. For example, the rose or my t-shirt. And on the other hand, an accident is the quality, the attribute of a thing. It is that which cannot exist on its own, but only within some sort of substance. Like, for example, red. The rose is red, the t-shirt is red. But also, let's say, heat, let's say, saltiness also. These are things that cannot exist on their own. Like there is no such thing as red as such, and you will never see a redness in the world. But rather, there are red substances like the rose or my t-shirt. And likewise, there is no such thing as saltiness on its own, and you will never just encounter saltiness, but rather you will encounter objects that are salty, like certain foods, certain dishes that are salty. Or heat. There is not heat as such. There is hot objects, be it hot water or hot air or hot metal or whatever, but only hot something, never just hot as such. So that is what substance and accidents means. That's why it's called by Kant also subsistence and inherence. You could say, if you want to not say it so correctly, but just sort of describe it, the substance is that which subsists. It's sort of the basis, the fundament on which you could say the attributes are glued onto. And on the other hand, those accidents, those attributes, they are inherent in that substance. They are within it. The red is in the rose. The saltiness is in the salty food. The heat is in the hot water, and so on. And what's important for one is to not confuse the concept of substance with the concept of matter. In today's language, we might often use them somewhat interchangeably. So when we talk about substances, we may think of material substances, of certain matters. But to Kant, matter is already an essential, an empirical concept. Because matter is something that exists in space, that is extended in space. And what matter is it's the phenomenon. So the appearance of the concept of substance to our outer sense. Right? The inner sense was the one, I talked about that in the lecture on sensuality. The inner sense was the one by which we perceive our own thoughts and feelings and so on, our representations in time. And the outer sense, which has the form of viewing that is space, perceives what is outside of us. And indeed, if we are to perceive a substance through the outer sense as outside of us in space, it must be a material substance. We cannot perceive anything outside of us that is not either matter or an accident of matter, like the red or the heat or the saltiness. There's nothing else for us in space. I can say that a priori, that everything I encounter in space, if it's not the attribute of another thing, if it's not inherent in another thing, must be a material thing, must be extended in space. But that is not what substance as such is. That is only what a substance is that appears to me in space. Substance as such is only defined as a thing that exists not as another thing's attribute, but as its own thing. So therefore, there could also be immaterial substances that have no spatial or also temporal extension. So for one example, God would be thought of as a substance and having certain accidents like almightiness, being all-knowing, being holy. Those are inherent in God. Like all accidents, they can't exist by themselves. You can't think of, for example, might or knowledge, no matter if it's almighty and all-knowing or limited might, limited knowledge. You can't conceive of them as just existing as such, like some disembodied might that is not someone's might, but just might. Or knowledge that is not someone's knowledge, but just knowledge. You can't just think that. You have to think of those as being accidents belonging to a certain substance. And that substance, in this case, would be God. God has these attributes of being all-knowing, all-powerful, and God, on the other hand, is not someone else's attribute. That also would not make sense. Just like you can't use God as an adjective, so to say. Just like you can't use rose as an adjective. So you can say the t-shirt is red, but you cannot say the t-shirt is rose, because the rose is a substance. And just like that, you can say God, you can say someone is knowledgeable or someone is mighty, but you cannot say someone is God. If you try to use God not as a noun, then of course you could say that, but as an adjective, that would not make sense. So God is its own substance, even though he clearly isn't a material substance. So it's important to distinguish that. Also, what should be noted is that we cannot perceive a substance as such, because all our perception, I talked about that in the lecture on sensuality, has two parts. The form comes from us, that is time and space, the forms of our viewing, and the material is the sensations we have. Colors, smells, tastes, feelings, and so on. And these sensations, they always give us accidents, right? I don't sense the rose as such. I sense the redness of the rose. I sense the greenness of its leaf. I sense the smell of the rose. And I don't sense sugar as such. I sense the whiteness, I sense the sweetness, and so on. If I try to imagine a substance without any accidents, that substance, that thought doesn't make sense. That substance would not exist for me because I could not possibly have any sensation of that substance. Like, I can think of a substance as having different accidents than it actually has. I can think of my red t-shirt actually being blue or green or whatever. But if I think of it as having no color and also no feeling when I touch it, so I could just grab right through it without feeling anything, and so on, having no smell, no taste if I try to bite into it, nothing, then there would not be any t-shirt left for me. I need a thing to have certain accidents, certain attributes I can sense, I can have impressions of, or else that thing is not there for me. It would be invisible, untouchable, unsmellable, and so on, and then it would just not be there. So the substance for us cannot be seen or heard or smelled or whatever. It cannot be sensed. It must be thought. This is not just true for material substances, but of course for all substances. I can only know a substance insofar as it, so to say, reaches out of itself, insofar as it affects me and with its accidents has a sort of effect on me. And this is also true for myself. This goes back to, and maybe also explains a little further, to what I talked about in my lecture on the apperception, on self-consciousness, where I said that according to Kant, just like there is no thing in itself that we can know, we can only know the things that appear to us, there's also no I in itself that we can know. Because what do I know of myself? Only my accidents, like the thoughts, the desires, the feelings I have. So the way I appear to myself in the inner sense, in time, my thoughts and feelings and so on changing with time. So I can only know myself the way I affect myself. And that was what Kant called the empirical apperception. And that gives us the empirical I, the homo phenomenon. But the I of the transcendental apperception, the homo noumenon, as I said in that lecture, can't be known. I can't know what I am as a substance, independently from how I affect myself and independently from the accidents, like the changing thoughts and feelings that that might be inherent in myself as a substance. And that is why I can't make any statements about that substance. So, for example, I cannot say that this I of mine is an immortal soul that will live on after my body has died. That is not something I can know, Kant says. I can only know my accidents, and those I only know within that life. I don't know if when I die, my accidents will just change, I will have other thoughts, or if I will vanish altogether. I cannot know that because I don't know my substance. This fact that we only sense accidents and not substances may also once again point you towards Kant's transcendental idealism and how it is indeed true. Because it goes to show that this is something we don't perceive, we don't experience passively. It is something that we think, just like causality. For causality, Hume had already shown that, and that was what put Kant on the path towards his transcendental idealism. Hume had shown that causality is not something we perceive, but rather something we think. Like, I don't perceive that one ball rolls away because another ball has rolled against it. I only perceive that the first ball rolls against the second, and then the second starts rolling away, but I don't perceive that it happens because of the first ball's impulse. But just like that, and this is something that Hume had not noted. Hume had focused on causality, which is the second category of relation, but Kant realized that the same is true for the substance, for the first category of relation. Substance is also something I don't perceive. Just like I don't see the second ball rolling away because of the first ball, I don't perceive the balls as such at all. I perceive their colors in space, maybe. Maybe I perceive a sound when one ball hits the other one. But I don't perceive the ball as a substance independently of its accidents. I think that there must be a substance. I think that there cannot just be a color flying disembodied in space, but rather there must be something which is colored that way. But that is my thought, this something. And Kant also says that we have to think this way, it cannot be any other way, and that it is nonsense to complain about that. Like, there were people who complained that, oh, our limited human mind can never look into the things, it only ever sees the surface of things, we can never understand the substances, only the accidents. Kant said, well, yes, that is how our human thinking works. Complaining about that, like, this is the very basis of our thinking. A human being cannot possibly think in another way. So complaining about that actually means wanting to not be a human being at all anymore, wanting to have a completely different way of thinking or of cognition, wanting to be some other sort of being, like maybe an angel or whatever. So that is quite irrational. I also want to take this opportunity and point out that this concept of substance and accidents is helpful to better understand Kant's theory of time and space, about which I talked in the lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing. I said that prior to Kant there was this conflict between Newton and Leibniz, between empiricism and rationalism. And with these concepts now, you can better understand this conflict. I said that the empiricists, I said that Newton basically talked that space is itself a thing which contains all the other things. Same for time, being a thing which contains them. So space is like a sort of vast, empty container in which all the other things are contained. And on the other hand, Leibniz and the rationalists talk that no, space and time are the relation of the objects to one another. So space is the next to each other of the objects, and time is the succession of the objects. Well, now we can explain this in more thorough philosophical terminology, and we can say that basically what Newton is saying is space and time, but for to make it more easy, let's stick with space now. Space is itself a substance. It is its own substance, so something that doesn't exist as an attribute of other substances, but that exists by itself. And this, of course, brings problems. This, as Kant pointed out, would first raise the question, okay, the other substances are in space. Like I can say my organs as substances are in my body. But where is space? Like I know where my body is, it's here in my house, and I know where the house is and so on. But space would be the ultimate substance that contains all the others. What contains space? We can only say that bigger, a vaster space contains a smaller space. But then where's that space? And also, if space is a substance, and we believe space to be unlimited, infinite, then that would mean having an infinite substance, which is not something we can really think. If you go with Kant and take space to not be a substance, but just our way of viewing things, and therefore viewing substances outside of us, then that's not a problem anymore. Then the question, where is space, doesn't arise. Or in another way, you could answer it with, it is within us, it is within our consciousness. We must think, or we must view things in space. And also, if you go with Kant, there is no problem of an infinite thing existing, because space, according to Kant, is not a thing that exists independently on us and independently of us, and then as an independent thing is infinite, but rather space is our form of viewing things. And now we can say that our form of viewing is infinite, meaning wherever we go in the universe, as long as we view things, as long as we perceive things, there will still be space, because we simply have to perceive things in space. We cannot perceive them any other way. So in that way, the space really is infinite for us, because we can never stop viewing things in space. But that doesn't mean that space as such, independently of ourselves, is an infinite object. Well, and on the other hand, you could explain what Leibniz and the rationalists are saying, as they are basically claiming that space is not a substance, but an accident. That space is not its own independent thing. Like, according to Newton, you could basically take all the things in time and space away, and time and space as such would still remain. Because, once again, they are not accidents, they are substances. They exist on their own. You would then have a completely empty space and a completely empty time in which nothing happens, but which still flows on. While, according to Leibniz, basically time and space are inherent in the objects. They are basically attributes of the objects. An object is not in time and space, but rather an object has time and space in relation to other objects. And so if all objects would vanish, so would time and space. But this comes with the problem that time and space are then not absolutely necessary. Like, it's like the color red, right? The rose is red. The redness is inherent in the rose, okay, but not everything needs to be red. There can be things in which the red color is not inherent. And just like that, I could now, if I go with Leibniz, assume that maybe there are things in the universe in which space or time don't exist as an accident, and which therefore are not spatial or temporal. I could not a priori be sure that everything must be in space and time. I could only say a posteriori that so far everything I found in the world has been spatial and temporal. And also, as Kant again and again criticizes, this basically takes away our ability to apply mathematics to nature and to use it in physics. Because I can't know if, for example, space and if space is something that is just inherent in certain objects, then I can't know if the rules of space that I find in my geometry, if those rules apply to all the objects. So geometry might say that every object can be divided evermore into infinitely smaller parts, because that's how it works in geometry, right? If you have a line from A to B, you can halve it, and now the line from A to the middle between A and B can be halved again, and so on and so on. There's never a smallest part. You can always divide it further. But if you go with Leibniz, we could not be sure if the same is true of the objects in space, if they can also be divided evermore, or if they might have some sort of smallest part which cannot further be divided. Kant once again solves this by saying time and space are our forms of viewing, our forms of intuition. Then, of course, it is clear that all things that we do view must conform to the rules of our viewing, of our time and space, and therefore geometry, for example, must be applicable to the things out there in the world, because they really aren't out there in a way. They are in our consciousness. They are what we view them as. So this might be helpful, these concepts of substance and accidents, to better understand the positions of Newton and Leibniz. And also it might be helpful to better understand Kant's solution, because as I said in that lecture and as I said in other lectures, whenever Kant is faced with the opposition between empiricism and rationalism, so with the claim that something, like in this case time and space, comes to us only from experience, or it comes to us from our own thinking, Kant is on the side of rationalism, and therefore on the side of saying there is such a thing as a priori knowledge, there is such a thing as knowledge that can be apodictic, so things that are necessary, things that we can really be sure of, instead of just asserting them to be true because that's how we found it in experience. But I also said, while classical rationalism is dogmatic and objective, so it says that the things we find in our intellect, they have some objective truths. They are out there in the object. Kant's rationalism is always subjective and critical. So he is saying that not everything comes from experience through the senses. There is something that comes from our intellect, but therefore, since it comes from our intellect and not from outside, it has subjective truths. It has truths. Subjective here doesn't mean that, oh, it's just my individual opinion, it's not true and all. It has truths for everything that I, as a subject, am conscious of, because those are the rules according to which my consciousness of objects works. And so the objects I am conscious of must conform to those rules. But it does not have truth in regards to things in themselves, things independently of my consciousness. So you could say, if Newton says time and space are their own substances, existing independently of other things, and on the other hand, Leibniz and the rationalists say that time and space are accidents being inherent in things. Kant is a rationalist insofar as he also says they are accidents, they are inherent in something. But Leibniz would be an objective rationalist when he claims that time and space are inherent in the objects that are in time and space, while Kant would be a subjective rationalist by claiming that time and space are inherent in us, in our consciousness. They are our accidents, so to say. We can only view things and perceive things in time and space. And so they are true, they are attributes of the things insofar as these things are our representations, as insofar as they are things appearing to us. This I at least find helpful in better understanding Kant's position and also how it relates to the other positions. And I also find it helpful in addressing possible criticism of Kant. Because there has been such criticism, and especially in our age, it is sort of fashionable to disagree with Kant and to say, no, transcendental idealism is incorrect, and time and space, they are not our forms of viewing. And the problem, however, is with current day philosophy, or rather with that which calls itself philosophy nowadays, but it really is no proper philosophy. It's just philodoxy, love of opinion, not love of wisdom. The problem is how superficial it is, and that goes for lots of so-called academic philosophy. It may not seem superficial for the layperson because the arguments may be complicated and the language may be difficult because there's a lot of terminology, academic terminology in it, but don't let that fool you. The thing is, they are superficial because no matter how complicated, they are still just throwing around opinions that anyone could have, including the layperson. What is lacking is a firm fundament. That's not talk. Even if you study philosophology, you don't get taught the fundamentals, the fundamental methods, the fundamental concepts, the fundamental terminology. There is no such thing as a philosophy, as a subject nowadays. And if you actually teach these things to yourself, which is really the only way to go nowadays, then this becomes really noticeable. Then you will read a text and an essay, let's say, disagreeing with Kant, and you will read some arguments why Kant is wrong, and you will maybe find that the author of the text presents his own opinion about time or space, saying, oh, we should rather conceive of space in this or that way. But he will never be clear in his language, because I tell you, not to deceive on purpose, but rather because he's not clear in his own thinking. He will never get to the point. He will try to explain how he views space in many, many words, but he will never clearly say, okay, according to me, space is a substance, or according to me, space is an accident. And of course they won't say that. If they said it, So clearly, first off, they would have to self-reflect to even get to that clarity, because they couldn't answer you, is space a substance or an accident in your COV, even if you asked you. But also they don't want to reflect about that, and they don't want to reach that clarity, because then, of course, you could much more easily attack them. Because it's just so very obvious that both is not a position that can be held. Like, it's so obvious that space and time, both as substances and as accidents, just doesn't work. But the thing is, everything, absolutely everything that exists, you can think about that yourself, and you can try to find the third thing. You won't. Absolutely everything that exists must exist either as a substance, so as something that is its own thing and not another thing's attribute, or it must exist as an attribute of another thing. Either it's a substance like the rose or the t-shirt or God or the soul, or it is an accident like red or knowledge or goodness or evilness or heat or cold. There is no third thing. That is how our thinking works. We cannot possibly conceive of a thing, an existing thing or a non-existing thing, a fantasy being. We cannot possibly conceive of anything that is not either a thing or the quality of a thing. So your theory of time and space must come down to, and it says a lot about your lack of philosophical thoroughness and rigor, if you can't put it into those words. It must come down to either saying time and space are substances or accidents. And both is a position that could easily be disproven. So that only leaves the one possibility to say they are neither, they are not something at all. Because, again, every something is either a substance or an accident. They are our forms of viewing some things. So if anything, they are our accidents of our consciousness. So I really don't see how anyone, if put in these clear terms, could seriously disagree with that. Of course, people will still do that. But I don't think it's a position you can actually, in all seriousness, hold and defend in philosophy. But anyways, let's turn to the other categories of relation, that is causality and community. Kant says that the first category, so substance and accidents, is really about the relation of a thing with itself, so to say. A thing being related to its own attributes. The other two, causality and community, they are actually about the relation of different substances, so of different things. And in that way, the first of these three categories is sort of the basis for the other two. And that is just like it is in the table of judgments with the judgments of relation. Because here too, the first type of judgment, the categorical judgment, is really only about the relation of the judgment with itself. It is about the relation of the predicate with the subject. Like when you say Kant is a philosopher, that is categorical, because you're saying that the predicate of being a philosopher is related to the subject Kant. Or when you are saying that human beings are not immortal, you are saying that the predicate of immortality is not related to the subject human being. Those are categorical judgments from which the category of substance and accidents is derived, right? Because that's really the same thing as saying the substance Kant has this accident of being a philosopher, or the substance human being does not have the accident of immortality. But then Kant says the other two types of judgments, they are really relations of several categorical judgments. So in the hypothetical judgment, if A, then B, for example, if a human being is dead, he doesn't breathe anymore, I have two categorical judgments. The human being is dead. The subject human has the predicate of being dead, and the other judgment is the human doesn't breathe. So the subject, this would be categorical negative judgment. The subject human does not have this predicate of breathing. And in the disjunctive judgments, you have a disjunction between several categorical judgments. So when you say a human being is either dead or alive, you are saying that there is the categorical judgment, the human being subject is dead, predicate, or the human being subject is alive, predicate. And you are now making a disjunction between those two categorical judgments. The same, Kant says, is true for the categories, where causality and also community mean that there's a relation between different substances. Like in the judgments, there's a relation between different categorical judgments. When it comes to causality, this is about substances being subordinated. It is about one being dependent on another. But that is important, not as a substance as such, but only in its accidents. Causality means that the accidents of a substance are dependent on another substance. So if I were to recolor and dye my red t-shirt blue, then I could say that the accidents, the color of the t-shirt, which previously was red and now is blue, depends on another substance, the dye, the color. And that substance is the cause for the change in accidents of that other substance. Or when I say the sun melts ice and turns it into water, then it is the accident that changes from being solid to being fluid, from being cold to being warmer. But the substance as such remains. That is important. Causality is always about one substance changing another substance accidents. A substance as such cannot ever change. And this is also something, of course, that is important as a law for doing physics, right? That a new substance in the world can not be created, and an existing substance cannot be destroyed. You can only ever change the attributes of a substance, even if that change is a big and radical one that completely seems to transform the substance. Like, of course, I could not just dye the t-shirt, I could burn it to ashes. Most people would think that has changed the substance, but you must realize how fundamental this philosophical concept of substance is. You really must abstract from all the attributes. Not just the color, but also, for example, the shape that the t-shirt has in space is still just an accident. You can change all the attributes of the thing, but the substance as such, which sort of carries those attributes, that cannot be changed. Well, Anyways, and then as the third category, we have the category of community, or mutual action, as Kant also says sometimes, meaning that you have two or more substances that act on one another. So it's not a one-sided relationship like in causality, where one is dependent on the other, but the other is not dependent on that one. But here they influence each other and they depend on each other mutually. The most simple example for that would be simple touching. So if you have two things in space that touch one another, then one is not simply the cause of the other, but rather they influence each other equally, so to say. This is, however, the one category that probably gets misunderstood the most. And that therefore requires further explanation. Because even the category of reality in the categories of quality it can be misunderstood because of the name. But if you get explained, as I did, what the name means, that reality is not meaning existence, or rather, if you look back to the judgment that the category of reality is based on, the affirmative judgment, which just says that a predicate does belong to a subject, but doesn't say anything about whether that subject with this predicate exists or doesn't exist, then it is easy to avoid misunderstanding and to understand what reality means to Kant. But when it comes to the category of community, it's not just a category that is easily misunderstood because of the name, but also the very judgment which it is based on, the disjunctive judgment, also often gets misunderstood. Because when people hear community, or Kant also sometimes gives it the Latin name commercium, so commerce, or when they hear mutual action, they will often imagine two things existing, so to say, independently of each other, and now acting upon each other. And that could lead to the question, is that or should that really be its own category? Is that not just another form of causality? Just both of them being each other's cause at the same time, or maybe interchangeably, maybe one having an effect on the other and then the other affecting the first one back. And this, of course, is also how the disjunctive judgment is often viewed. When people hear disjunctive judgment, they usually think of the word or. So a disjunctive judgment being an either-or judgment. And they also think of two options that are not necessarily connected, and that this contrasting them, so to say, with this either-or is just arbitrary. We just choose to make them opposites, but they aren't really necessarily. And therefore, I find this category of community to be very, very misunderstood. Even by experts, it often gets misunderstood, including myself. I also used to misunderstand it when I first read Kant, and even when I read all of Kant's published works, so that's the first 9 volumes of his collected works. It really helped reading the other 20 volumes, which include his lectures, his notes, his letters, to get a more clear understanding of that category. Kant, sometimes in lectures and so on, instead of calling it the category of community or mutual action or commerce, he sometimes calls it the category of the whole and the parts. And I think that would actually be a better name, a name leading to less misunderstandings. Because it is not about two things independent of each other, somehow coming together and affecting each other, but rather it is about a bigger whole that has several parts, and within that whole, these parts, since they are parts of the same whole, determine each other. Because simply by being this part, and so to say occupying this space, which therefore can't be occupied by another part, this part gives the other part its place on the opposing side. And in the same way, this other part, by occupying this opposing side, gives the first part its place on this side. And the same way you should understand the disjunctive judgments. And I talked about this in the previous lecture on the table of judgments. I said it's not just an arbitrary either or because you decide to create an opposition that didn't have to be there, but rather it is about having a general concept, and that concept being divided into several subclasses, into several options. So when you say humans are either dead or alive, this is not an arbitrary opposition, but rather you take the concept of a human being, which could be represented as a sphere, and you divide that sphere into the half of the humans who are alive and the half of the humans who are dead. And they are both part of that general concept of being a human. And now they determine each other, meaning if you know someone's place on one side, you know he doesn't belong to the other side. If you know that Kant is dead, you immediately know in the disjunctive judgment that Kant can't also be alive. And this, therefore, is really how you should understand this category of community. Once again, it has often been misunderstood, including by experts, by scholars. For example, Schopenhauer's criticism of this category is based on this misunderstanding. He says there is no mutual action in nature. There's just causality that goes back and forth. It's just a causal relationship of one substance towards the other and that other back towards the first one. But that is just because, not just here, but in general, Schopenhauer is a very superficial reader of Kant and hasn't really understood Kant. If you really understand Kant, a better example for the category of community, or as I said, of the whole and the parts, would be the body, for example. The body is a whole, and the organs as its parts, they form a community or a commerce with each other, Kant would say. And this is not so much about back and forth causality, that is just about each of them having its own necessary place within that whole, and by having that place, giving the others their place. So since the heart occupies this place and since it's pumping the blood through the body, the other organs don't have their place and don't have their job. They have their own job, but they depend on each other, right? They are not simply each other's cause. Like the heart is not the cause of the brain, and the brain is not the cause of the heart or of the lungs. If anything, the body as a whole could be considered their cause, or if you want, you could say the genes out of which this body grew could be considered the cause. But they form a community within which each has its own place and needs the others to occupy their places and to do their job. Um, I also want to digress a bit and make an, I think, important note on that category. I think it is no coincidence that this category was found by Kant in the Age of Enlightenment, and I think it is quite important. Now, of course, Kant doesn't ascribe any special importance to this category. It is one of 12, not more or less important than the other 11. But the fact he included it among those 12 at all is already a big accomplishment. That's not a given to understand that there is not just the relation of substance and accidents and the relation of causality, which really had been known since antiquity. I mean, substance and accidents, that goes back to Aristotle. And of course, causality is also something that humans had known for a long, long time. But to really be aware that there's also this community, this whole and the parts. Of course, in a way, humans had always known that too. I mean, Kant is saying that all 12 of these categories are the basic elements of our thinking. So humans must, for as long as they have thought, had these 12 categories. But it's quite another thing to really become aware of them, to really reflect on them and become conscious of them. And I think this really is one of the accomplishments of the age of Aufklärung. Because in the history of thought, if you don't take it to be patchwork, as it is often taken nowadays, and if you don't look at just individual thinkers and their individual opinions, but if you, so to say, take a step back and take in the broader, more holistic picture, you will note that each age has its certain themes, topics, ways of thinking, and each age has its own contributions to make to the history of human thinking. Like, for example, you might say the 19th century is the century of history, the century of development. No matter how different the various theories of various important thinkers in that century, take Hegel's dialectic philosophy about the development of the spirit and of consciousness, take Marx's theory of the development of history undergoing different stages according to the dialectic law in history, or take Darwin's theory of evolution. All of those important thinkers in the 19th century, in one way or another, were focused on the concept of becoming, of development, of history. And that is a contrast with what came before. Because before, we were in our thinking not yet so aware of the fact that things are not just the same, but they become. Like, if you look to antiquity, there's no real conception of that. I mean, someone like the Eliads, Parmenides, who say there is only being, all movement, all change is an illusion. Or someone like Plato, who says that the realm of the sensual, precisely because it changes, doesn't really exist. The only really existing things are the ever unchanging ideas. So here the change is just dismissed, really. And even as far as the 18th century, so Kant's time, focusing on change and becoming and history is not really such a big thing yet. Kant's own philosophy, and that is one of its flaws, is still quite stale. I mean, you can see that in this whole table of categories. Like Kant just puts them there. Like these are the 12 categories. There's no becoming, no developing here. They just are. The consciousness that Kant speaks about is an already developed, already sort of finished consciousness, and only after Kant with Fichte did thinkers start thinking about how does this all come about? How does this develop? Now, that's not to say that there was no conception of history at all in the 18th century. Of course, there already was. And I mean, the very idea of Aufklärung is the idea of a process of going from being unaufklärt to being aufklärt. So it necessarily includes the idea of history, of progress. But I mean, that is always the case in the history of thought, that a new thought doesn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere. There's no big revolution in thinking. Rather, there is a slow, gradual development. So when I say that a certain age focuses on one thought or contributes one new thought to humanity, you will always be able to go back to earlier ages and already spot the seeds of that later development, always spot that later thought starting to be established. But still, you can observe that certain ages, well, in a metaphor, if the seed was planted before and the plant grew before, you can still see that a certain age is the one to make the flower blossom, so that all subsequent ages can then eat from the fruit. So if the 19th century was the century establishing the thought of history firmly in our thinking, then I would claim that the age coming before that, the age of Aufklärung, Kant's age, among other things, as one of its main contributions to human thought, established this category of community, of true community, not just things arbitrarily being piled together, but rather forming a system, forming a whole in which the parts mutually depend on each other. Because that's not an isolated thought of Kant's. That's also a thought that in one way or another, other thinkers of his age had. Kant himself, in finding this category and putting it in the table of categories, was certainly influenced by Newton, who had found and established this in natural science, that there is not just one-sided causality in nature, but there are instances where objects in nature depend on one another. And I claim that this is no coincidence, rather this belongs to the age of Aufklärung, because unaufklärtness always has this victim posture. The unaufklärt person likes to think of himself and also of others as being victims, being passive, depending on something else, which ultimately means thinking only in terms of causality, of cause and effect, and me being affected by being caused by something else. But Aufklärung needs dialogue, needs pluralism to develop. And Aufklärung is about assuming the posture of a perpetrator. So realizing, as Kant does in thinking, where he realizes that empiricism is wrong and we don't just empty blank slates that take in things through experience, but that we sort of make our experience. Aufklärung is about realizing that you are a perpetrator, that you are active. And of course, you are not just active. Of course, there is passivity. Because if you were not dependent at all on other things, if you were entirely independent, you would be God. Only God is not depending on other things, but other things depend on him. But we may depend, and there is room for causality and for thinking within causality. I also don't want to say that there's within the category, within the table of categories, there is such a thing as good categories and evil categories. I don't want to say the category of community is good and that of causality is evil. There is a place for causal thinking, but it shouldn't be the only mode of thinking. And yes, there is passivity, there is dependence in life, but there's also activity, there's also shaping life. And ultimately, it would be better to think of us not just as being dependent victims, but rather as of being in dialogue with the world and with life, responding to life, to say it in terms of Nietzsche, dancing with life. And I think we can find that this category has played since the age of Aufklärung a bigger and bigger role in human thinking. Because the category of causality really, it belongs to monarchical times, right? It belongs to monarchical times. It is really a hierarchical, an authoritarian way of thinking. But a republic should not be structured just in terms of causality, but in terms of community. And more and more, we have maybe come to the understanding that, for example, a government should not just rule over subjects and order them around, but it should be in dialogue with the citizens, with free citizens, and it should form a community. The citizens with each other should form a community, and they should also be in community with the government. And likewise, you could say that in raising children, in teaching children in school, in the past, like in the 19th century, we still thought of that as very much a causal process. The teacher being the cause, and the school children just sort of passively depending on the teacher, just being empty receptacles to be filled with knowledge. But a good teacher will think of this as more being a mutual process, as being in community with the students. That doesn't mean that they are all the same. That doesn't mean that the teacher will not stand in front at all anymore and will just sit down at a table and everything will just be equalized and there will be no differences. But still, there will be not a one-sided process, but a mutual process. And a good teacher would always tell you that he's not just teaching his students, he's also learning lots and lots from his students. And once again, I think that if you look at the development of human thought, you find that after the age of Aufklärung, more and more we have developed in this direction. So the 19th century, which was still very authoritarian, still very much thought in terms of causality. So like in biology, when you first had the theory of evolution established, it was still very much about taking the species to be passive victims of their environment. So the environment forces them to adapt, forces them to change or to die. But since then, biologists more and more have found that Of course, a species doesn't exist in a vacuum. Of course, it depends on its environment in a way, but also it also plays an active role within that environment. It doesn't just adapt to it, it also shapes its environment. Or likewise in sociology, in older theories, still very much the human being was thought to be dependent on his socialization, on his milieu, as it was called, and to be more or less a passive victim of that. While nowadays we understand better and better that surely the way we grow up and surely our surroundings, they shape us, but we also shape them. We are not just passive objects of social processes, but we are subjects of them. They are our processes, and we shape and change the society we are in. And that's, I would say, why you can find that in more recent times in the history of thought, every thinker, and of course, when I say that, I mean every thinker of worth, those who haven't thought that way in the more recent decades or in the last century or so, they are simply of no value in the history of thought, and they won't go on to have an important impact probably. But anyone of value in more recent times has been, in one way or another, very much focused on this category of community. Be it someone like Nietzsche, be it someone like the structuralists like Lévi-Strauss, or be it someone like Foucault, who, for example, when talking about history in general or specifically about Aufklärung, recognized that human beings are both subjects and objects of these processes. They are, of course, dependent on them, but they are also actors with their own agency who shape them. All of these thinkers and others, in one way or another, have been focused not on one-sided dependence, but on two-sided, so to say, mutual dependence or mutual affection, on how, yes, there is the side of passivity and of taking in and of being open, but there's also the side of being active and of giving and of shaping. And this, I think, would be especially important for our age, because of course this process hasn't closed. We still very much think in only in causal, hierarchical terms in many instances, and we still haven't learned to think in terms of community more. But of course, especially nowadays, this would be important. People need to learn to think in this category of community or commerce or whole and parts. They need to understand themselves as a part of one humanity. They need to understand themselves as part of one world, as world citizens, one global community. They need to understand that globalization is a fact that will continue, and that we need to take seriously. Like, of course, some of its forms it has taken, or some of its effects are devastating, no doubt about that, but we cannot just turn back the clock, nor should we want to. We have to actively shape it. But we need to realize that we are in a community, and that we cannot just isolate ourselves. We can also not just pretend to live on an island. Even if we do live on an island, like the British with their Brexit, that doesn't work anymore. And we cannot just say our nation first or our nation alone. We must realize whatever affects, the world is so interconnected now, whatever affects one of us in one way or another affects all of us. Like, if there is a war in Ukraine because Russia is attacking Ukraine, well, they are amongst the main producers of grain in the world. So a war in Ukraine may lead to hunger and starvation in Africa. And that in turn may lead to new waves of refugees coming to Europe and affecting our lives and affecting our politics, of course, in Europe. So really, the world is too interconnected to just act like a turtle and retreat into your shell. You have to realize that you are part of a whole. And of course, this also very much goes for how we deal with nature. We must understand that we don't have just a causal relationship to nature. We can't just subjugate nature and be a cause and treat nature as a mere effect that we shape or we exploit and we destroy however we like. Rather, we must understand that we are part of nature and that what affects nature affects us. We are in a community with our environment. And in the end, this sort of thinking is exactly what wisdom is about for Kant. Here I refer back to my lecture on what is wisdom to Kant. You could say that thinking in terms of the category of causality, that is more about being smart, being prudent, being able to reach your goal. For that, you must know what can cause my goal, what can cause the effect I want. How can I sort of manipulate the world to get to the point where I want to get to. But wisdom by Kant was defined as understanding what my true goal should be, understanding what the end goal should be, to which all other goals should be subjected as mere means to that end. Understanding my purpose as a person, or the purpose of humanity, the vocation of humanity. And this exactly is a thinking in terms of the third category, thinking in terms of the whole, which would be this higher, this ultimate purpose, and the parts, and understanding that the other purposes, the other ends, they are just parts of that whole. They should lead to the ultimate goal of wisdom, to the highest good. And the problem is that many people can't even do that when it comes to their own person. Like, even when it comes to just their body or their psyche and their health, they will very often not think in terms of community, of the whole and the part, but rather they will make one part absolute and sacrifice the other parts for that. So they will lead an unhealthy lifestyle. They will eat unhealthy food, for example, because, well, they have that appetite, or they will take drugs because that's their desire. Or, I don't know, the teenager who doesn't get enough sleep, who stays awake half the night and also ruins his eyes because he's staring at a screen in the dark the whole night. All of this means that one part assumes rulership and treats the other parts like slaves, or like they don't matter, like they are disposable, and subjugates the other parts. And you end up sacrificing the other parts for that one part, without realizing that that other part is not independent of them. And he's also not in a arbitrary connection with them, like the grains on a pile of sand that could anytime be disconnected, but rather he really forms a community with them. he really is part of a greater whole. And so what affects the other part affects him too. If you ruin your health like that, if you sacrifice other parts of your body or psyche for one part, it in the end will also come back to that one part and ruin that one part too. And it will bite you in the ass. And the same, so if people can't even do that on an individual level, then of course it's a problem that the same is true on a bigger level. What affects some parts of the world or some parts of nature will come back to bite us in the ass, because it will affect us too. So wisdom, and I mean wisdom is the ultimate goal of Aufklärung, that is where Aufklärung should lead to. Wisdom is about realizing that you are part of a bigger whole. But with that, let's finally turn to the last three categories, to those of modality. They are possibility, existence, and necessity, and their opposites. So impossibility, non-existence, and not necessity, which would be contingency. And you could say that belonging to the dynamic class, they all these categories are, as I already said, about the connection of the manifold of different kinds. But in the categories of relation, that manifold of different kinds was subordinated. It was depending on one another in its existence, right? The red depends on the flower in its existence. The melting of the ice depends on the sun in its existence. And the part depends on the whole, like the heart depends on the body in its existence. Here in modality now, the things are not, they are not subordinated in their existence, but rather they are coordinated in their existence, Kant says, meaning that the manifold of different kinds are connected within one experience, as belonging or not belonging to one experience. So when, for example, you say that in a triangle, there must by necessity be 180 degrees, you have a connection of things of different kind, like three angles and 180 degrees. They are of different kind, but they are connected within the triangle. And by saying that this connection is necessary, what you're saying is that it necessarily belongs to one experience. So you're saying it is not possible to experience a figure with three angles without at the same time experiencing these 180 degrees. Because they belong together in one experience. And likewise, if you say that a circle has no angles, you are really saying that those are not coordinated. They don't belong to the same experience. It is not possible to experience a circle while at the same time experiencing angles. Now, I don't think I need to say so much about these three categories of modality. It should be pretty much clear what possibility and existence. So note here we now have actual existence, not under the categories of quality where we had reality. It should be clear what possibility and existence and necessity are. I want to say some things about the necessity or about its opposite, that is contingency. Because what the philosopher says here differs a bit from how we would see things in everyday life. Usually when we say that something is not necessary, something is a coincidence, what we mean is that we don't know or we can't name the cause. So if I flip a coin, whether it's head or tail, usually we would say that's a coincidence, that's contingent, but really it is not, right? It was necessary for the coin to land this way according to the laws of nature. If we knew all the details, like how heavy exactly is the coin and each of its size, on which side did it lie in my hand when I threw it, in which degree did I throw it, with how much force did I throw it, how was the air, the velocity of the air. If I knew exactly all the details, I should be able to predict that the coin must necessarily land on this side or on that side. So really saying it's a coincidence just means that we don't really know the reason. And on the other hand, if we do know the reason, then we don't really say it's a coincidence. Like, if I say it's a coincidence I'm wearing a red t-shirt, that would sound to people as if this hadn't been planned. Like, I just reached within my wardrobe and by coincidence I grabbed the red t-shirt and not the blue one. Actually, it was a decision to wear a red t-shirt. I mean, there are no blue ones in my wardrobe. I can only grab red ones. It was a decision to wear the red t-shirt. But still, in the philosophical language, it is a coincidence or it is contingent insofar as I didn't have to make that decision. Like, yes, because I decided to do so, I now have a red t-shirt, but I could have decided to wear a blue t-shirt, right? So the thing is with the contingency, that in philosophical terms, it means that something could be different. It could be in another way. While necessity means it must be that way. It cannot be different. When you throw a stone at a window and now the window breaks, then in everyday life you will not say that the window broke by accident. You will say that it broke because of the stone. But in the language of the philosopher, the window breaking is contingent insofar as you could also not have thrown the stone. It was not destiny that the window broke. It didn't have to be that way in the course of the world, but rather only because it was hit by the stone did it break. So you could say that here you have a relative necessity. So depending on the cause of the stone hitting the window, it was necessary for the window to break, but in absolute terms, the window did not have to break, because the stone could also not have hit it. And here you can note that whether something is contingent or necessary within the world really depends on how we look at it. And also, all necessity that we deal with is only relative necessity. We can only say that something is necessary because of a cause. It is necessary as an effect of that cause, but we can never say something is absolutely necessary. It had to be that way and couldn't have been any other way. Kant says that necessity, taken in the absolute sense, is the abyss of reason. Like our reason trembles in front of it and can't grasp it, can't understand it. This is important later on when I will talk about Kant disproving all the attempted proofs for God, because they, of course, work with this concept of necessity. God is, according to definition, the necessary being. Because if there is a God, he cannot have a cause that created him, because then he would not be God, that other cause that came before him would then be God. But still, there must be a reason why there is a God and not rather no God. So, since that reason cannot be outside of God, it must be within him. He must be the being that is absolutely necessary, not relatively necessary, not necessary as the effect of a cause, but necessary absolutely in itself. But I mean, that is how we have to define God. But what that is to mean, and if there is such a thing possibly as an absolutely necessary being, that is something we can't understand, Kant says. And that becomes important because there is an attempted proof for God, the so-called ontological proof for God, which tries to say, well, God is defined as the necessary being. If we define him that way, then he must exist, because that's what necessary means. He must exist. To which Kant will reply, well, yeah, we define him as the necessary being. So if a being corresponding to that idea actually exists, if a necessary being actually exists, then it does exist with necessity, yes. But we can't say if a necessary being actually exists. We can't even understand what that should mean. But again, I will get to Kant dealing with the proofs for God at a later point. For now, I want to give a further explanation of the categories of modality as a whole. Because they, in a way, are different from the 9 other categories. Just like the 3 judgments of modality, as I explained in the last lecture, were different in a way from the other 9. I said that the other 9 affect the form of the judgment. And I can distinguish between them by the form of the judgment, right? Whether this is, for example, an affirmative judgment or a negative judgment, that is within the form. In one case, I say the subject is that predicate, and in the other case, I say the subject is not or does not have that predicate. Or whether I have a singular or universal judgment. I say this one subject is like that, or I say all the subjects of this class are like that. But I said judgments of modality, saying something could be the case, something is the case, or something must be the case, they don't change the form of the judgment as such. I said one and the same judgment could be problematic or assertive or apodictic, depending on who makes it, because the modality of the judgment was about the judging subject and about how the subject thinks this judgment, about how certain that subject is about its judgment. And just like that, Kant stresses, and this is extremely important to him, that these 3 categories of modality, they don't add to the object, but rather they are our 3 different ways of thinking that object, of relating that object to our thinking and to our experience. But they don't add to that object. So what is important is to not take them to be accidents that are within the substances, to not take them to be qualities that have a certain reality in an object. So like Kant would say, if you think of having $100 on your bank account, or you actually have $100 on your bank account, then the concept of $100 remains the same. 100 actual dollars that exist don't contain more than 100 possible dollars that don't exist, that just could possibly exist. And it's not like they have a higher value, or like you could buy more with them. If you think about what could I buy if I had $100, or what can I buy since I do have $100, you will think about the same things. All the things that cost $100 or less, and not more than $100. The only difference is if you say the $100 are not just possibly on my bank account, but they actually exist. The only difference is precisely that, that you say this thing to which this concept applies. So the money with this value, the money by which I could buy these and that things, this actually is there instead of just being talked about. So when you think of something, even something that doesn't exist, like let's say you think of a unicorn, you will think of the substance having several accidents that have reality within that substance. You can think of the unicorn as having a horn, looking like a horse, having white fur, having magic powers if you want. And now, if in your thoughts you give it another attribute, a new accident, let's say you think that this unicorn can talk, or that this unicorn is immortal, then you have now extended your concept. You are now thinking of a different thing than you did before, right? And a talking unicorn is different from a non-talking unicorn, or a unicorn that is immortal is different in some way from a mortal unicorn. But now, if you think of this unicorn that you have thought up as being something that is not just possible, but that actually exists somewhere in the world, then you have not added anything new to the concept of the unicorn. You don't think anything new within that concept. Like a white unicorn that can talk and that is immortal and that is magic and that actually exists is not different in nature, in its attributes, from a white and talking and immortal and magical unicorn that doesn't exist. The difference is just that you think of them in a different way. In the second case, if you say it exists, you think of it as being part of your at least potential experience. You say, this exists, so therefore I could possibly experience it somewhere in the world. But that's all. So the modality doesn't add anything new to the object as such, or rather to the thought of the object. I have once heard modality be explained in a way which I think is a good way to visualize it. Think of a hand. The hand can be open, or the hand can be closed into a fist. Now the hand, as such, has certain accidents. It has a color. It's a white hand or a black hand. It has a certain size, like the fingers may be longer or shorter. Maybe the hand is wearing rings, or maybe the nails of the fingers are painted. And those are actual accidents of the hand. And those are what you will think of when you think of this specific hand as opposed to other hands. But now if the hand is open and now it closes into a fist, none of the attributes have changed. Like the skin color hasn't changed, the fingers haven't grown longer. It's not like the hand changed its nature, like it became a different sort of hand. It's just that the mode in which the hand exists is now another one. It now exists not as an open hand, but as a closed fist. And just like that, when you think of a thing as being possible, or as existing, or being necessary, you always think of the same thing, but you think it as being in a different mode, as being as just a possible thing that you think of but that doesn't truly exist, or being an actual thing that could be found somewhere in the world maybe. And this once again will become very important when Kant deals with possible proofs for God, because he will point out that when we think of God as a necessary being, we must not treat that necessity as an attribute of God's, like we do his almightiness or his knowledge or whatever. Here grammar can fool us, because of course grammatically to say God is almighty and God is necessary, or to say the unicorn is white and the unicorn is possible, grammatically this seems to be the same. Subject is the predicate. So it seems that this predicate is an accident, an attribute that we ascribe to this thing. But we must not be fooled by that, Kant says. In one case, we really are speaking about an attribute of that thing. But in the other case, we are speaking of the mode in which a thing with these and that attributes is. Is that a possible thing, an existing thing, or a necessary thing? So those are the 12 categories. Before closing this off, I once again want to point out that they fall into two classes. And you can sort of see that just like in the table of the judgments, you could see that quantity and quality form one class by the fact that here and only here, the first and the third judgment sort of were the same in strictly logical formal terms. Just like that here, you can note that in the second class, in the dynamic class, you always have two corresponding concepts. While in the first class, you only have one concept in each place. You have, for example, just reality, negation, and limitation. So 3 times 1. But in the dynamic class, in each place, you actually have two corresponding concepts. It's especially obvious in modality, because here it's opposing opposites, right? Possibility and impossibility, existence and non-existence, necessity and contingency. In the group of relation, it's not quite as obvious. It depends a bit on the names given. Like if the second one is named causality and the third category is named community, then it seems like just one concept. But if you name them as substance and accidents, cause and effect, or as Kant also says, as cause and dependence, and lastly as the whole and the parts, then it becomes obvious that here too you have corresponding concepts that depend on another. Like you can't think one of the other. You can't think of something being a cause without also thinking the concept of an effect that is caused by it. Or you can't think of something being a part without thinking the concept of a whole of which it is a part. Just like you can't think of something being necessary without at the same time having the concept of something that is not necessary in your thinking. So there seems to be some relation within these classes. And I will go more into the classes and why they matter in later lectures, but for now I can say that the concepts of the first class, according to Kant, they are more about our viewing. So about perception as such. The ones of quantity are about the perception of time and space, because really all quantities we find in time and space. And if I want to extend something's quantity, as I already said, I must think of it as being bigger in space, taking up more space, or having a longer extension in time, existing for a longer time. While on the other hand, quality is not about time and space, like the quality of a thing. So once again, let's take temperature, let's take the heat of water. It doesn't matter the time, right? The water could be 100 degrees, whether you stick your finger in it for a second or into it for an hour. Still, the water is 100 degrees. The quality is not different because the time of experiencing that quality is more extended. So the categories of quality, they are also about viewing, but not about time and space as our forms of viewing, but rather about that which we view in time and space, about the content of our viewing, and that, as I explained in the lecture on sensuality, that are our sensations. The categories of quality are about sensations, like color, heat, smell, and so on. But then the categories of the dynamic class, they are not about viewing things, about perceiving things, but rather they are about the relations of things. The category of relation is about the relation of things within themselves or to one another, right? The relation to their own attributes, the relation to their causes and their effects, or the relation to their parts or to the whole of which they are a part. While the category of modality is about the relation of the things to us, to our thinking. It is about their existence. How are they related to our thinking? Do I think of them as merely being possible or actually existing or being necessary? And that is also why when you want to explain transcendental idealism, which I already did in its own lecture, it is more easy to explain it with the categories of the dynamic class. Precisely because they are not just about what we view, what we perceive, but about the relations of those things we view. And there it is more easy to explain and to give examples to show that these relations are really our thoughts and not things we view, right? That is why Hume could see that causality is not something I see, I observe in the world. I don't see A causing B. I just see A happening and then B happening. But rather, I think that A caused B. And the same in this lecture, I explained for the category of substance. I said, I don't actually see substances. I see and I hear and I smell and so on accidents. And then I think that these accidents cannot exist by themselves. They must exist as the accidents of something, of a something that subsists, so to say, beneath them. While for the categories of the mathematic class, it is much harder to give examples and to explain to someone that they too are just thoughts. Like someone will think that, okay, maybe I don't see causality in the world, but I do see unity, or I do see multiplicity. That is not just my thought, that is actually there. I see that there's one thing or that there are many things, but in fact, no. Kant would say that this too is a thought. This too is something we think. Quantity is always about us repeating a certain representation, making a certain representation several times. So, for example, in the forest, I have the representation of a tree several times. I repeat that. and connecting these several representations to, for example, come to the judgment that they form a unity. And that connection is done by the intellect. And maybe the category of unity is most suited to give examples to make this a little more obvious. Because really, if you think about it, unities are not simply in the world. Unities are your judgments about the world. Like when you say that something in nature belongs together, like the trees in a forest, well, I don't think that the trees think of themselves as making up one forest. It is really you who decides to judge them to be a unity. Or if you say that a certain species forms a unity, you may think that this is a real unity, right? Like if you say that all the dolphins, as dolphins, they are a unity. They are, well, dolphins and not something else. They are one species. Surely that's a fact of nature, a fact of biology, right? But once again, I don't think that the dolphins themselves think of themselves as forming a unity. Especially since there are also various subspecies, but even within one such subspecies, it is really you who judges them to form a unity. And now you can form different unities depending on how you make your judgment and what you focus on. Like, for example, you could say that the dolphins don't form a unity with the fish. Rather, they form a unity with us and with horses and dogs and so on because they are mammals. But that is only one way to look at it and to judge things. That way, you judge dolphins to belong to the unity of mammals. But you could also say that they do form one unity with the fish. If you say they are both sea creatures, they are both creatures living not on land but in the sea. So that way you have created a different sort of unity, not based on biological family relation, on genetic proximity, but based on where and how they live. And that is really on you. How you want to judge, how you want to think of things as being unities or multiplicities. You may also consider, if you look at a painting, like the Mona Lisa, you judge it to be a unity, right? There may be different colors and different brushes of different lines of the brush, but still you judge them to form one picture and therefore make up a unity. Well, now let's say someone were to ruin that picture by drawing a line across it, across the face of the Mona Lisa, taking a pen, taking an adding, and just drawing a line over it. Why would we say that the painting is now ruined? Well, because we say that now the painting is no longer a unity, but rather it now is a multiplicity. There now are two things, the Mona Lisa and this line drawn across it. But when the Mona Lisa wasn't finished yet and Da Vinci drew the line of her eyebrow, we wouldn't have said that, oh, now he ruined the painting. Because this line we didn't take to be a multiplicity, something different from the painting, but rather as belonging to that unity. But why? That is our judgment. Like, that is not something that, so to say, is objectively in the painting. I don't think that the painting itself feels ruined if now a line is drawn over it. And I also don't think that a being which was only sensual, so which could perceive the painting, which could perceive the colors or the shapes in some form, but which had no intellect, no thinking, no capacity of judging this painting. So let's say there's a fly flying around in the Louvre and seeing the painting. The fly would not judge that now the painting was ruined after someone drew a line across it. Only a being with intellect, which doesn't just have the sensations of the various colors, but which has this concept of unity, only such a being could say, well, these various colors, these various shapes, these various lines of the brush, they still, despite being a manifold, they still belong to one unity. And this new line drawn across it does not belong to that unity. So now we have a multiplicity on the canvas and therefore a ruined painting. That is a judgment. And I hope this goes to show that not just the 6 dynamic, but in fact all 12 categories are categories of our thinking. What Kant is saying is that in everything we experience, in all our cognitions, there is sensuality and intellectuality. The sensuality has 2 parts, as I explained in the video on sensuality. It has a content, the sensations we have, and it has a form, time and space. But everything else, which in a way is only one thing, that is connection, composition, synthesis, everything else, because this one thing comes to us in 12 things, because we have 12 ways of judging, 12 ways of forming connections, 12 ways of synthesizing. Everything else is our concepts and must be conceived through these 12 categories, because they are the fundamental, the basic elements of all our thinking. And you can try that for yourself. I will talk more about it and what exactly it means in the next lecture. But you can try for yourself if you can think of anything without using these 12 categories. And you will find that even when you use other concepts, like, of course, we have a bunch of empirical concepts like tree or dog or whatever, but still, Kant would say they all contain these 12 basic concepts, these 12 categories. Like when you think of the dog, you clearly think of a thing that is a unity. Like the dog has many parts that belong to one body. You think of the dog as having certain qualities that have reality in him. And also you negate other qualities. Like maybe you say the dog is brown or white or so on. But you say the dog doesn't have scholarly knowledge. The dog doesn't have a human intellect. And you also think of the dog as being a substance with accidents, of being the effect of its parents who caused him, and also being itself a cause of other things, like the barking sound you hear. And of course you think of the dog as existing, and not just being possible, but also not necessarily existing. Or let's say you think of a murder, then you necessarily think causality, because that's what murdering is. You're saying that someone was the cause for someone else dying. So the point of Kant is that in all our thinking and in all judgments, therefore, we make about things, and therefore in all experiences, these 12 categories, which I now explained in this lecture, form the basis. And what else there can be said about them, and what importance they have for Kant and for his philosophical system, that I want to get into in the next lecture. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.